are live streaming, and I'm going to hit start.
I'll just jump in and say good morning or good evening to everyone who's joining us from the waiting room. I see we've got people still trickling in, so we'll probably give it a minute or two before we get started.
All right, Courtney, are we ready?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. We might get a few more people joining the conversation as the panel gets going.
Great. Okay, well, why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We welcome all those of you who are following Vietnam's climate commitments and energy development, as well as those of you who care about the Mekong River, because tonight we're launching a report. Actually, we've been waiting long to launch this report about how Vietnam's climate commitments can be linked to the Mekong River and the Mekong River conservation. We think that there's a grand opportunity for Vietnam to act smartly and strategically, as outlined in this report, which was lead authored by my colleague Courtney Weatherby, and with co-authors Jake Brunner and myself. We're excited to launch this report. Many of you might be familiar with our Letters from the Mekong series, where we've in the past written a report about Cambodia's smart energy development and water conservation opportunities, smart planning for hydropower in Laos. Courtney recently also authored a technical study on how Thailand can engage smartly with the Lao PDR and Cambodia on smart energy development that helps to conserve river resources. And this is our Vietnam report. And we see Vietnam as probably the most important actor in the region that can shift Mekong River development into a better course of development, a smarter course of development. At the same time, we see Vietnam making ambitious commitments at the COP meetings, particularly at COP26 and now at COP27 for decarbonization. So Vietnam not only has an opportunity to really emerge as a regional sustainability leader, but as a champion for developing countries with their climate commitments and decarbonization commitments. And our report outlines ways, not all the ways, but some strategies that Vietnam can take forward and put to good use into the coming years. Again, we're very proud to launch this report. It was made possible with funding from IUCN through the IUCN Bridge Project, of which the Stimson team is proud and happy as always to work with IUCN and the team there on our partnership to do exactly what this report promises, a way to move forward the renewable energy transition and conserve river resources. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will give kind of a keynote and an overview of Vietnam's energy sector developments and give us some thoughts on the report. We've invited Nguyen Mai Phung, who's the Vietnam country director from the Asia Group. Nguyen Mai Phung, sorry, I might not be pronouncing your name correctly because in my intro it's ordered in different ways. But you are the Vietnam country director for the Asia Group, and she supports client activity across the board by providing insights into key political dynamics and economic drivers, and delivers stakeholder engagement support for businesses who are seeking to expand their network in Vietnam. She's worked as a civil servant, spanning more than 20 years, including roles with the State Committee for Population and Planning in Vietnam, within the Ministry of Industry and Trade and the Directorate of Energy. I can't think of a better person to kick off the launch of this report than Nguyen Mai Phung here. And over to you, Phung. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for all the nice words about me. Ladies and gentlemen, good mornings and good evening to all. It is my honor to speak on behalf of the Asia Group at these discussions on Vietnam COP26 commitments and renewable energy transitions. As we all know, Vietnam is currently a fast-growing economy within the ASEAN regions, which increasingly rapid urbanizations and industrializations. With this come the opportunities for Vietnam to envisage the restructuring its energy sector to increase the use of renewable and more efficient form of energy. Greening the energy sector will also allow Vietnam to improve the quality of its energy services, create new jobs, and modernize domestic industry to adapt to the demands of climate change. At today's discussions, I'd like to share some comments on the directions of the power industry in context of Vietnam's energy transitions to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Vietnam's primary domestic energy supply appear unlikely to meet rising demand, and thus the structure of energy supply is teetering towards imbalance and depends on imported resources is increasing. The government's visions for power development is oriented toward fuel diversifications and structures integrity, with high priority given to renewable energy developments and the harmonizations of projects allocation across each of the country's three regions, North, Central, and South. Developing the grid in parallel with new power source will have relief pressure from regions with greater power capacity than necessary, especially in terms of renewable energy, such as in the South, and will have to stabilize and improve the quality of national power transmissions. After Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh pledged in November 2021 at COP26 that Vietnam would reach net zero emissions by 2050, Vietnam's national power development plans for 2021 to 2030 with the visions to 2050 refer to as the PDP-8 for short, has undergone many rounds of revisions. The Ministry of Industry and Trade of Vietnam has on November 11th of this year submitted a report to Prime Minister on finalizing the PDP-8. The report details the role of each energy source in Vietnam's future power mix, including coal thermal power, domestic gas fire power, and imported energy fire power, as well as wind and solar. Regarding the coal-fired power plants, in terms of the coal power, Vietnam currently operates 39 plants with a total capacity of just under 25,000 megawatts. Looking ahead, there are 7 projects equaling around 7,000 megawatts under construction and expected to enter into operations, and another 5 projects accounting for nearly 7,000 megawatts that are under discussions by facing obstacles. The MOIT is discussing with the investor of these 5 projects on their potential withdrawal. Under the upcoming PDP-8, there will be just over 30,000 megawatts of coal-fired capacity in the countries by 2030. Regarding the domestic gas use, out of more than 7,000 megawatts of existing gas power plants using combined cycle gas turbine technologies, there are up to 6,900 megawatt a project shifted from revisions PDP number 7. However, the actual progress of these projects will depend on the improvement of the administrative procedures on the Vietnamese side, as well as the determinations to develop and explore gas field carried by foreign constructor. For example, the Blue Whale field, which will be operated by ExxonMobil from USA. Regarding the imported LNG, representing on the portions of the 17,900 megawatt capacity, which was included in the PDP 7 revised, and the draft of the PDP 8 only add 6,000 megawatts in the period up to 2030 for projects located in the northern regions to increase its power supply. Then from 2031 to 2035, an additional capacity of 7,500 megawatt will be added. The draft of the PDP-8 also orients that after 2030, the LNG will be coal-fired with the hydrogens gradually increase in the rate of coal-fired to 2050, and from 2050 onward will completely switch to hydrogen. The draft of PDP-8 has tried to limit the developments of more projects relying on imported LNG. When coal power is reduced, a cleaner and flexible base load power source to absorb solar and wind power can only be gas power. However, many power and energy experts still wonder about the feasibilities of a large volumes of LNG's power brought into Vietnam from now to 2030. Regarding the solar and wind power plants, recently Vietnam achieved its developing renewable energy source worthy of recognition. Thanks to the feed-in tariff mechanisms authorized under former Prime Minister Nguyen Xuân Phúc, prior to this mechanism before 2017, there was almost no solar power projects due to the lack of a preferential price mechanism. After these decisions from 2018, the scale of PV solar increased dramatically from only 86 megawatt to nearly 16,500 megawatt by end of 2020, an increase of nearly to 20,000% in just 3 years. Tens of billions of dollars of investment have been mobilized mainly from the private capital. The draft PDP-8 set out plans to allocate and develop solar energy resource into 6 sub-regions according to a schedule that is in harmonization with traditional fuel source in Vietnam's abilities to develop its transmission grid. As for the rooftop solar power, the expert says it is necessary to encourage this type of the energies. These small-scale projects can quickly mobilize domestic and private capital without requiring foreign loan. The draft of the PDP-8 proposed to develop rooftop solar up to capacity of 3,000 megawatt by 2030. However, this is still quite conservative and not commensurate with the potential. Although not as developed as solar power, the wind power is growing rapidly in Vietnam, especially after the feed-in tariff mechanism introduced in the decisions number 39 of the Prime Minister. The scale of wind power has grown from only 90 megawatt in 2017 to reach to over 4,100 megawatts by November 2021. That means more than 25 times. In the draft of the PDP8, the scale of solar and wind power will grow up to 19,500 megawatts and 28,480 megawatts by 2030, of which 7,000 megawatts is offshore wind power, and up to 168,900 megawatts solar and 153,500 megawatts respectively for wind by 2050, of which 87,500 megawatts is offshore wind power. So Vietnam's strong energy transitions is reflected in specific number when renewable energy account for 48.8% in 2020, including hydropower, but excluding solar PV, which will increase to 66.2% by 2050. So before ending my comments, I'd like to highlight some of the comments as follow. It can be seen that Vietnam's power structure is well on its way, transitioning from the using fossil fuel to use renewable, green, and sustainable energy sources. By 2050, about 50 to 60% of total electricity generations will be supplied from the renewable energy sources. The second point is, according to the MOIT estimations, in order to achieve the set target, the total capital required for the power development is very large. During the period from now until 2030, the total need for investment capital for the power sector is about 104 to 142 billion US dollar. Of which about 9 to 12 billion each year will be for developing new power generation source, and about 1.5 to 1.6 billions would be put aside for the grid developments. The third point is the PDP8 need to be approved soon, as still are not yet approved at the moment. The next phase will be reviewed to update according to the new situation. This would demonstrate the openness of the PDP. The slower it's approved, a series of projects cannot be implemented when it is near the end of 2022. The technologies and financial supply chains is in danger of being broken if it is not approved in early time. The last point is the government's operating plan should be proactively and appropriately adjust when there are fluctuations in the increase of the power demand, changes in the schedule of important plants, prices of renewable, as well as new energy technologies. So the above are some of my opinions on Vietnam national power development's orientations and how the latter would need to be geared to realize the national climate change goal as stated at the COP26. So I look forward to hearing more from our panel discussions today, as well as from the audience through the Q&A sections. Thank you very much. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Mai, and I'm getting your name right now, and I've been straightened out. Sorry for that confusion earlier.
No
Thank you
problem.
for those comments. You know, you have such in-depth understanding of Vietnam's needs, particularly via these Power Development Plan 8 revisions. I hope and wish you success in your efforts to drive progress forward in that line. And if you do have questions, those of you who are tuning in for Mai, please do leave them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them later during the discussion portion of our report launch. Now we're going to turn to my fellow co-authors who are going to provide an overview of the report itself. Many of you know our team's work, so I'm not going to go into deep introductions of Courtney Weatherby and Jake Brunner. Courtney Weatherby is the Deputy Director of the Stimson Southeast Asia program. She and I have been working for 7 years together now, promoting a theory of change that we believe can shift the Mekong into a trajectory of more sustainable development. And like I said, we take country-based approaches to addressing that theory of change with recommendations and partners like IUCN, who's been an iron partner of our work ever since Jake Brunner and I met in Phnom Penh 5 or 6 years ago. And we realized that we share this theory of change, and that it's not too late to change the trajectory of development and conserve the Mekong's natural resources for the tens of millions of people who rely on them. So Courtney and Jake, who is the Indo-Burma Hotspot Director at IUCN and also leads the Vietnam effort there for IUCN, are going to lead us through the high-level takeaways from this report. Courtney, over to you first.
Thank you, Brian. So, as Brian said, we're going to go ahead and just share a summary of the report, and I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint with everyone, which hopefully is coming through clearly. I'm essentially going to kick things off with an overview of the renewable energy transition, progress to date and challenges inside Vietnam and sort of where things are going in the future, and then turn things over to Jake to talk about the value of strategic energy planning and system scale planning, as well as a little bit on electricity trade. So I am going to skip through some of the statistics a little bit because I think Mai did a really good job of giving an overview. But I do think it's valuable to start out when we're thinking about how Vietnam is going to meet its net zero by 2050 commitments, and also its reduction of coal pledges, to think about sort of the progress that Vietnam has made to date. So just to sort of reiterate a little bit, I think it's worth recognizing that Vietnam set global records with the speed of the development of solar power domestically, where in less than 5 years, it went from having almost nothing connected to the grid in 2017 to having almost 16,000 or just over 16,000 megawatts of grid connected power by early 2022. It's particularly noticeable that Vietnam's power development in this sector was not just large-scale utility projects, but also rooftop solar. This has set records in ASEAN. Vietnam sort of skyrocketed past all of the other ASEAN countries combined in the amount of solar that it's deployed, and it is significantly and by far the most invested in rooftop solar. So you have over 101,000 individual rooftop units on commercial, industrial, and also household rooftops that are now connected to the grid in Vietnam. And this is notable both in terms of sort of forward-looking aspects, but also in terms of the challenges that it provides in terms of grid management. But nonetheless, it is important to recognize, because Vietnam's success in this case can potentially be replicated in its neighboring countries. There's an opportunity to share lessons learned, both in terms of what worked, like the feed-in tariff rate that Mai mentioned earlier, that was really attractive, that was placed by the government, and which prompted a huge outpouring of private sector investment, and sort of the other approaches that led to mostly Vietnamese investors driving this forward. So as Mike mentioned, there's huge targets for continuing to expand solar and wind in the future and build on this initial success that Vietnam has had with solar, and also increasingly with wind. And I do think it's valuable within that space to recognize that much of that future development is going to be in wind. When you're looking in specific numbers, obviously the amount of wind capacity in Vietnam is about 1/4 that of the current solar capacity. But there's a real huge opportunity for expansion in Vietnam. So in terms of looking at the future, there's an estimated 404,000 megawatts of potential medium scale or good and some good high quality scale wind potential onshore in Vietnam. And a recent study by the Asian Development Bank indicated that there could be up to 500,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So when you look at those targets that Mai was mentioning of 100 of 153,000 megawatts for wind by 2050, and then you compare that against the potential, it is very doable, even though it will require a massive outpouring of investment to get there. And within that space, I do think it's also worth noting that solar and wind in some ways are very complementary, because solar provides electricity most effectively, obviously during the daytime when the sun is shining. Wind tends to have a higher profile for productivity in the evening, at night, and also in a seasonal manner that sort of complements solar and the other hydropower and other sort of seasonally dependent aspects of Vietnam's grid quite nicely. So when we're talking about investment to meet those massive build-outs in future energy needs, it is going to take a lot of continuous investment in power generation and also transmission. And Mai gave us some really specific updated numbers and sort of a range in terms of what's needed on an annual average. I'd previously seen it about 11 billion annually needed in previous predictions, but I think that Mai's updated in more detailed iteration, highlighting what's needed for power generation and transmission is valuable. Not the least because it just paints the sort of the challenge and the scope of the challenge that Vietnam faces in terms of mobilizing continued private sector investment. And to sort of paint the picture of where things are going, I think it is valuable to look at who has done the investment to date. Analysis using our team's Mekong Infrastructure Tracker, which is not a fully complete data set in terms of project level data, but is comprehensive enough to do some general analysis, indicates that the vast majority of renewable energy investment across solar, wind, and also biomass in Vietnam has been driven by domestic companies. About 58% of the projects that we have project level data on in terms of who in terms of companies are sponsoring or developing projects and then coding them by country indicates that the majority, that 58%, were done by only Vietnamese companies with no direct partner. And then an additional 27% of projects were done by a Vietnamese company with an international partner. There's a fairly limited number of projects which were developed only by international investors. And most of the investors that were involved, particularly in the solar sector, were coming from other countries in Asia. So if you're looking at sort of the number of projects, Thailand was sort of the largest investor from outside Vietnam. Japan, the Philippines, and Singapore also played roles here in terms of bringing investment in from the beginning to develop these projects. Now, this is certainly something that may shift over time in terms of the profile, because oftentimes these projects do change hands. So China was noticeably absent from some of our initial analysis here, but China played a key role in the supply chain for solar panels, and there have been a number of acquisitions by Chinese companies of projects that were initially developed by Vietnamese stakeholders. So it is clear that there's interest from a wide range of outside investors in expanding power generation in Vietnam and investing in this space. But when you're looking at sort of the financing limitations available for Vietnamese public funds, but also sort of the risk tolerance and ability to continue investing at this rate by domestic companies, it is clear that there's going to likely need to be some policy changes to unlock additional external investment to keep up that rate of 11 billion or more dollars every year in new power generation and transmission, particularly because even though energy is sort of the backbone of economic development, there's a lot of investment needed in other types of infrastructure in Vietnam as well, which will start to sort of pull attention from government and public funds, particularly given that there is private sector funding available for these energy projects. So when we're looking to the future, I think it is valuable to consider what are some of the obstacles to continued renewable energy expansion, especially in terms of recognizing both policy changes that the government may need to make and also some of the challenges that investors may face in terms of coming in to support continued renewable energy. There's a whole laundry list, and I'm not going to go into too many of the details in the interest of time tonight, because these are documented in the report as well as in other discussions online. But there's sort of a laundry list of mostly regulatory concerns that international investors in particular have had about the renewable energy space in Vietnam. And that has been sort of a key factor limiting their expansion of investment in Vietnamese solar plants and then also wind projects. So some of these are things like power purchase agreements in terms of how they allocate risk, how much of the risk is taken on by the project developer versus how much of the risk is taken on by the national utilities. The risk allocation was often critiqued by international investors to be unbalanced. There's been uncertainty over the future of pricing for solar and wind in Vietnam, given that the feed-in tariff for both was adjusted numerous times in recent years, partly in response to the robust response from the private sector. But this uncertainty stems from the fact that there were so many adjustments and that there were lengthy periods of time where there actually was no active feed-in tariff in place. And so until there is clarity on that future pricing, whether it's going to be a feed-in tariff or an auction scheme, I think that's going to be difficult to attract additional investment. And then in addition to some of those other regulatory obstacles I mentioned, I think perhaps the greatest challenge, which Mai also did talk about, is grid integration of renewable energy. So solar is variable, and when you have more than 101,000 rooftop projects, as well as more than 80 new solar and wind projects at sort of utility scale that are connected suddenly into the grid, and they are not producing constantly in the same way that traditional power sources like fossil fuel or hydropower could produce, this does pose a challenge for grid operators. It requires a different approach to grid maintenance. And in the case of Vietnam, because there's so much variable energy that's been brought on so quickly, it has, especially in certain provinces where there's concentrated investment, kind of catapulted Vietnam past the point early on in the renewable energy transition where most of this variability can be managed by changes to grid operation, to the point, especially in provinces, again, that have high concentrations of new solar and wind projects, where actual investment in the grid and changing the way that the grid is designed and invested in is necessary to ensure stability and electricity reliability. So just to sort of show the scale of the problem with solar, for instance, this map on the right side of the screen here shows all of the provinces in Vietnam, and they're color-coded by the number of solar projects that are in individual provinces. And you can see that there are some provinces where there's limited data on new or there's no significant new solar investments in recent years. And then the darker and more orange an individual province gets, the higher the number of projects. And this is not mapping the rooftop solar. This is only mapping the commercial and utility scale solar projects. But you can see that there's a couple provinces along the coast that are heavily concentrated with more than 30 projects, and then a number of provinces through the Central Highlands, which also have significant numbers of solar projects. This often can lead to the grid being essentially overwhelmed in certain areas where there's so much variability when the sun is shining and suddenly all of these projects are producing solar power, that it could kind of disrupt the grid significantly. And so as a result, this has caused the operators in many areas to curtail some of the projects, essentially committing that they're only going to purchase a certain amount from individual projects because they need to maintain the stability of the grid overall. And this is a challenge for investment because it impacts the ability of the investors to get the return on their investment on the timescale that they originally envisaged when they were sort of making their plans and looking at bankability and funding for projects. So in the short to medium term, this is going to be sort of a potential obstacle for new investment coming in. And in fact, in 2022, there was actually a pause put by the national utilities on connection of new solar and wind projects to the grid because there's so much that they're already struggling to integrate. So I do have faith that this will ultimately be worked out. Mai has already highlighted sort of the very specific investment needs for transmission. There are a number of plans in place to try and address this. So I think in the long term, in order to meet the targets that Vietnam has already put into its power development plan, there is going to be the changes needed to integrate this power and then once again expand new renewable energy generation and investment. The big challenge is the timeline on which that happens and the ability to sort of coordinate that without disruptions to the supply chain. So with that all in mind, there's obviously a very positive opportunity here for Vietnam to expand renewable energy investment. But at the same time, there's also an impetus for Vietnam to consider purchasing electricity from its neighbors in order to support the expansion of renewable energy at home, and also to sort of consider expanding the broader role of renewable energy through imports from Laos, which has energy available from a variety of different projects. So with that in mind, I'm going to sort of stop here and turn things over to my colleague Jake, who will talk about the electricity trade and sort of the strategic opportunities on the table for Vietnam.
Thank you, Courtney. So Mai and Courtney have spoken in some detail about the speed of Vietnam's clean energy transition. But herein lies a risk, because if coal is replaced in large part by hydropower, the impacts on fisheries and biodiversity, freshwater biodiversity, will be huge and essentially irreversible. What the official discourse, and I'm talking here about both the government, among the governments and development partners, what the discourse typically misses is that the energy transition is not only a chance to reduce carbon emissions, but also, done right, to reduce threats to fisheries, which are of critical importance, particularly here in the Mekong. Courtney, could you present my slide? Thank you. I've tried to compress a lot of information into the slide. On the right are sort of basic facts and figures on fisheries. About 2.3 million tons a year are caught, worth about $11 billion. This makes the Lower Mekong the world's largest freshwater fishery. In fact, the Tonle Sap itself in Cambodia produces more fish than all the freshwater fish production in Canada and the US. So it's extraordinary productivity. And fish and other aquatic organisms or animals are absolutely vital for food security and micronutrients, nutritional quality. In Cambodia, depends on freshwater fish, primarily from the Tonle Sap, for something like 70% of its animal protein intake. So fisheries is really an issue of national security, particularly in Cambodia. Now, most of the catch consumed by households is not sold or reported. And this is problematic because when there are cost-benefit analyses of dams in particular, irrigation projects, large structural projects, the socioeconomic value of fisheries is essentially either unknown or easily discounted or hugely underestimated. And lastly, and this is critical, fisheries, the productivity of the fish, the diversity of fish species, the yield, depends critically on the free movement of fish, both vertically up and down the river, all the way from Thailand down to the Mekong Delta, and horizontally across the major floodplains, notably the Tonle Sap and the Mekong Delta. Now, on the right are three pie charts, and those show the volume, the weight of fish that are caught in the upper Mekong, the middle Mekong, or the central Mekong, and the lower Mekong. Those are shown roughly on the maps. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is there are two shades of gray. It's the lighter gray. Something on the order of 3/4 of all of the fish caught and eaten in the lower Mekong River Basin are what are called long-range migrants. And the map on the left shows some of the routes these migrant fish take. They migrate upstream to spawn, and then the eggs and the fry basically drift downstream, and they enter particularly the Tonle Sap where they mature. And the dams, I've illustrated some of the dams which threaten this vertical migration. There's the Sayaburi up in Laos, and the Don Sahong on the Laos border with Cambodia. The lower Sekong 2 was complete a few years ago, and what that did was that disconnected two major rivers from the Mekong mainstream, the Sesan and the Srepok. And that has left the Sekong River, which rises in Vietnam, flows through Laos, enters Cambodia, as the last free-flowing tributary of the Mekong. And recent research has shown of extreme importance for fish migration and consequently fish productivity and food security. The Sekong A Dam is probably 50% complete. This, in fact, is an extremely small dam in terms of energy production, something about 80 megawatts, so barely a rounding error in regional energy supply. But it would cut off 90% of the Mekong, making it a very bad deal in terms of sort of the cost benefit. So to avoid these impacts, we have argued over the last 5 or 6 years, but I think with growing authority and growing conviction as more and more data and evidence come to light, that a process of regional energy planning and investment that maximizes the integration of solar and wind into the energy mix and is selective about which dams are built and maximizes regional power trade is the best way for the region to meet its international climate change and its biodiversity commitments. This, in a sense, was perhaps the driving force behind this publication. It's very much oriented towards the COP26 climate change commitments, but it's equally relevant for the COP15, which is taking place right now in Montreal. That's the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's equally important for Vietnam's international biodiversity commitments. Let me finish off just by quoting from a 2012 paper on trade-offs between food and energy in the Mekong that was co-authored by the Cambodian Fisheries Administration. It concludes, although socioeconomic process is desirable, sustainable development requires that unnecessary risks to ecosystems and environmental services, such as fish production and biodiversity, be avoided. I think that's actually a very practical, simple and practical definition of sustainable development. Development is absolutely the priority, but do so while avoiding unnecessary risks. And I think 10 years on from when that paper was published, it is cheaper and easier than ever before to avoid the unnecessary risks while achieving energy security and broader development goals. So it is the point I'd like to make is that a clean energy transition that maximizes solar and wind, emphasizes power trade, regional power trade, and as I said, is selective on which dams are built, really is the flip side, the other side of the coin to healthy freshwater ecosystems, food security, and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. And thanks for highlighting the importance of migratory fish and the need to keep their migratory fish pathways unblocked, particularly as there are fewer and fewer options now for those fish. I think that we can't underscore more how important that fishery is to the people of the Mekong, not just Cambodians who get 70 to 80% of their protein intake from that fish, that captured fishery, but all of Mekong countries are significant fish consumers and rely on that for a portion of their food security. In Cambodia, it's paramount, right? It's like a civilization guarantor. And we can go back and look at the history of Angkor Wat, and from which the Kingdom of Cambodia currently derives its very being, and look at the importance of fish and the Mekong as they are etched into the walls of Angkor Wat. Thanks for also pointing to the Sekong A Dam. This is a dam that Mekong watchers are all very much concerned, and it's 60% complete. Yet we do not know what the impacts of that dam will be on fisheries because there is no EIA released and made public by the developer or by the Lao government. And there's been very little public discourse, consultation around various issues surrounding that dam, whether it's resettlement, dam design, fish mitigation, etc. And it's never too late to start that public discourse, to learn more about that dam, and to possibly impact the outcome of that particular dam, because I've said many times that the Sekong A Dam is quote unquote a game over dam for the Mekong because of its devastating effect on the downstream fisheries, and that it is as dangerous as a mainstream Mekong dam in that part of the river. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a bit. And now we are going to hear from Nguyen Linh Dan, who will, I'm bringing up our bios, provide some commentary on the report and help kind of ground us in the realism of what's happening in Vietnam and the pragmatism of some of the policy recommendations and planning recommendations that are made in the report. Nguyen Linh Dan is a lecturer at the Department of Industrial Economics at Hanoi University of Science and Technology. Before joining the university in late 2020, she spent 4 years working at the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, a research institution for APEC Energy Working Group based in Tokyo. Dr. Nguyen graduated with a bachelor's degree from the Natural Economics University, majoring in environmental economics and management. She served as an Asia Edge Fellow with the National Bureau for Asian Research. Nguyen Linh Dan, it's a pleasure to have you here. What do you think of our report?
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me well?
Yes, can hear you very well.
Okay, good. So first of all, congratulations, Courtney, Brian, Jake, for completing the very important, interesting report. And yes, congratulations to the whole team who did the great contribution to until the publication. Well, up to this point, I think it's already very comprehensive. But I just want to recall one of my comments during the review period. Courtney sent me a draft of that, I think the beginning of this year or so, and she proposed like several topics, and I'm very happy that you took my comments into considerations. And one of the previous topic you sent to me, named Vietnam's regional energy leadership pathway to reaching COP26 commitment and saving the Mekongs. Is it possible to be the title of the project? But now it becomes like regional leadership on renewable energy and river conservation. Although the difference is very small, but I think that it's totally true to choose that as a title, because COP26 is not it's not the only one thing we are heading to. Vietnam has been building a strategy for green development, sustainable development, and not only because of commitment of COP26, we confirmed that we will still continue to go for sustainable development. And this is one of the very interesting topics that we also need to put into consideration, not only for domestic benefit, but also for the regional benefit. Let me recall one of my comments then. I think now it's totally okay for me after the explanation of Courtney, explanation of Jake. I think it's totally persuasive. But one of the comment of mine then was that one of the conclusion of the report is that if Vietnam is recommended not to support hydro project in Sekong A Dam, and I think it is quite a challenge, because if Vietnam stops doing so, is the certain that other countries won't do that? I mean, it's not buying electricity to meet the energy demand for domestic is very important for all the countries, surrounding countries. And I agree that Vietnam needs to take the leadership in Mekong area. However, if Vietnam stop support the hydro project, or stop buying the hydropower from the Sekong A Dam, will other countries won't do it, or other partners or other international organizations stop doing it as well? So not only the role of Vietnam, but also the role of other countries as well. And also, not only Vietnam should take the lead, but we need the cooperation of other surrounding countries, for example, Cambodia, China as well, even Myanmar, Thailand. So the other countries in the region. And I think one of the challenges of Vietnam, I totally agree of the rationale that we need to preserve the environment and also preserve the fish biodiversity, the fish diversity. However, like one of our how can I say, reason to purchase electricity from Laos is that we need electricity to fit our rapidly increasing demand domestically. So to some extent, from the point of view of Vietnam, the point of view of electricity industry, we still need it. The thing is, if we continue to buy hydropower from Laos in the future, probably the recommendation should be we should put into the contract, I mean the PPA, with some kind of request or some kind of regulations that not to harm the environment, or like you've just mentioned, we need to take the environmental impact assessment more thoroughly, in more places, so we know the detail of the impact, and we have to prepare for recovering such kind of cost. At the same time, I think Vietnam still continue to purchase power, because variable energy in Vietnam, such as wind and solar, can't provide enough sufficient energy for the economy, and the energy security needs to be preserved. So we can't say that we need to stop buying electricity from Laos, but it needs to align, or it needs to combine with some kind of regulations to prevent the environment in that area to be like damaged. And just a very minor point, environmental policies, environmental regulations is under Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, while energy demand and energy industry is under Ministry of Industry and Trade. So still inside domestically in Vietnam, we need the collaboration between these two ministries very closely in order to make this kind of recommendation realized. So that's just some of my comments. And also before this session, Courtney also asked me to raise some of the conservation in Vietnam after COP27. I would like to highlight some points, some points like this. So the top priority in Vietnam right now is, national energy security. And then the second priority is to prioritize clean and sustainable energy. And we also focusing on sustainable development with environmental protection. And for PDP 8, we will, for renewable energy integration, we need to balance between installed capacity and grid capacity. So not only we are not going to invest only capacity, but also to strengthen the grid in order to take most advantage of the renewable energy, which is now under a lot of curtailment. So as long as we can strengthen our grid capacity, I think we can save more variable renewables, which means that we don't need to import a lot of hydropower from the region, from Laos or from China. One of our important goals for 2030 and 2045 is that we intend to focusing on offshore wind. So we want to increase, I think Ms. Mai mentioned it in the beginning in her kickoff speech, that for offshore wind, we are going to target around 7 gigawatt in 2030 and up to 65 gigawatt in 2045, as we have a lot of potential for offshore wind. And Vietnam is, like Courtney mentioned, we are not going to invest in more coal-fired power plant, especially after 30. And instead of that, we want to promote the CHP, which is the combined heat and power, co-generation between coal and biomass. In order to make this come true, we need quite a huge investment. It really depends on the source. Some source like World Bank, they say we need around 12 to 14 billion USD for each year. But some source says we need up to 60 billions each year for reduction of up to 25% of CO2 emission by 2050. So that's some of my like takeaways for this regarding to these topics. If there is other questions, I'm very happy to talk more on this.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for those comments. And again, I think at the heart of your commentary is it feasible to be selective with the purchase of power for projects abroad? And you know, our assessment, actually the discourse that we promote is one that says it can be. And we've heard from officials in Cambodia and in Vietnam responses that it's possible, right? That it's not impossible. I do believe that both Cambodia and Vietnam should and could and are the most likely to act in their own interest to preserve the Tonle Sap and the Mekong Delta, to choose smart siting of hydropower projects and a smarter selection of projects, say solar and renewable, in Laos and Cambodia, to invest in. And that Vietnam has this legacy now of rapid solar expansion. And Courtney went over that, and we've looked at it during this talk, that it's very impressive. So all of these kind of tools in the toolbox have come together, yet we're seeing what we think are missteps, right? With the Sekong A Dam, even the Luang Prabang mainstream Mekong Dam. We could talk about that, whether it's a misstep or whether it's a smart strategy. And yet again, we say it's not too late to begin to embark on this selective, strategic vision for power generation development in the neighborhood. So thank you for those comments. I've got some questions as moderator, and we do have some questions in the Q&A box, but I'm going to ask a question to both Dan and Mai first about grid development. And please give me a second to bring it up. It actually came in from outside, and it's a great question. And it goes like this. We've talked about challenges to grid integration of renewable energy from the technical side. This also poses challenges, and also may identify opportunities for further private sector involvement. So let's talk about the private sector. Can you highlight how the private sector is now responding to issues with grid integration of solar and wind in Vietnam? What are some lessons learned, and how are they responding? Have these challenges posed an obstacle to further investment in renewable energy in the near to medium term? Dan or Mai?
May I take the questions? Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. So for previously investment and operate the grid is done by EVN only. That is the only authorities to work on that. But recently, when we have a lot of renewable projects put in operations and incur some of the obstacle of the grid connections, the private sector who invest to the renewable plants, for example, the solar farm or wind farm, which is they cannot wait until the EVN to construct the connection grid to their projects. So some of the private sector, they already invest the connection line from their own projects to the grid. That is the starting point for the private sector to involve in the grid investment. And recently, the Vietnam electricity law already revised and amended in some article, which is allow for the private sector to invest firstly to that kind of connecting line from the projects to the main to the backbone or the stations which is nearby. And the second things that the distribution system at the low level could be invest and operate by the private sector. However, the law it's allowed, but for the detailed guideline, it need to be worked by the MOIT to provide the very detailed guideline for the private sector when they do the investment. And the law also indicate some of the limitations. I mean the borderline between the investment by the publics and the private sector. For example, for the national regulatory system, it's done by the publics. For the transmissions line, it's operates and invest by the EVN, that means the public side. But there's only some of the small system which is invest by the private sector that should meet some of the required standards or conditions set by the MOIT to make sure that the system is stable and well harmonized. I think there's quite a number of the requirement would be set for the private sector if they wish to invest. However, we still need to wait for the specific guideline from the MOIT. But now the connecting line, it's already invest a lot from the private sector. So I hope that is answer the questions.
Thank you.
yeah.
Dan, please.
Yeah, may I add some points to that? And I think for your later questions, you ask if it is an obstacle for private sector. We will stop private sector from investment in renewable energy in Vietnam. I think the answer would be most probably no. As far as I understand that private sector are still concerned very strongly, have a strong concern in investing in renewable energy in Vietnam for, I think, at least for two reasons. The first reason is that the government is still very insist on the net zero emission pathway. So continue from COP 26, and now we bring it along to COP 27. We again saying that it's we will still continue this pathway. So I think this is one reason. The second reason is that international loans is still available. So and funds is still available. So as long as they see the opportunities for borrowing loans and have other funds for renewable energy, I think they can still find a way. And one of the examples is that I see many many companies, they are trying to do feasibility study in other business models rather than only solar power connect to the grid or solar power only. So they combine different business models to see which is the best for Vietnam. And I think in the future it will still increasing.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you both for those comments. We're going to stick on this comment, but open this kind of line of questioning and open it up to everyone. I've got a question from John Lichtenfeld from the Asia Group. What are the steps that can be taken to ensure that base load is met while avoiding destructive hydropower and limiting further fossil fuel build out? Anyone? How can you meet base load and still be selective in purchases of power and conserve natural resources? Courtney.
Well, I guess I'll jump in and sort of just start. I think there's sort of two aspects to this question, which are certainly related, but can also be addressed separately. And one of them is the baseload question. Obviously, when you're shifting towards variable renewable energy, that does pose a challenge because solar and wind are not dispatchable in the same way that fossil fuels and hydropower have traditionally been run. I do think there are significant untapped opportunities for energy storage, not just in Vietnam, but in the region. And this includes both things like pumped hydropower storage, where you've got often a closed loop system, and it uses hydropower technology to pump water from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir, and essentially makes that power dispatchable. So you can, for instance, link up a bunch of renewable energy projects to a pumped hydropower storage plant, and use the excess renewable energy when you've got, for instance, too much solar production going on at one point in time. You can store that as hydropower and then run it in a dispatchable manner. This is something the United States has done quite a lot of. Vietnam has one large-scale pumped hydropower storage project under development, and there's also a range of really interesting new projects that use, for instance, water towers to do the same thing. So there's opportunities there to expand more pilot projects in energy storage. Obviously, batteries are an option here as well. And the price of batteries is increasingly coming down in the United States and many other places around the world. There have been a number of hybrid solar battery storage systems which are still able to offer competitive rates. I don't think I've seen that operated on a large scale yet in Vietnam, although Mai or Dan might have insight into pilot projects that I'm personally not aware of. But I do think that is one opportunity as well to help stabilize these new energy sources and avoid disruptions to the grid and potentially make them dispatchable in the long term. But I do think that when you're thinking about sort of the opportunity for the second part of that question, to reduce impacts and be strategic and selective, it really is about, when you're looking at electricity trade, for instance, with Laos, choosing which hydropower projects you're purchasing power from, because Laos does have a very large number of projects that already exist and have excess electricity available, or projects that are still in earlier phases of development. And some of those projects, simply by virtue of where they are sited, are going to be more impactful than others. So it's about not just signing up to purchase electricity in terms of an amount of electricity, but in terms of, as Don mentioned earlier, regulating into the power purchase agreements with Laos or with individual projects, which selection of projects you want. And that does require further analysis. I mean, you can sort of estimate and compare the impacts of hydropower projects right now, but to really do a good job of this would require a much more detailed study to sort of identify, okay, what are sort of the projects that are red lines that have the clearest, most significant impact on currently free-flowing rivers or in biodiversity areas, and then just specifically strategically don't purchase power from those projects. So there are opportunities here that would still provide hydropower as a dispatchable baseload opportunity for Vietnam, but would still minimize those impacts.
Great. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I'm willing to go 5 minutes over, if all of you are, to answer as many as we can. So Dr. Richard Cronin, former director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program, has a question for Jake on how invested is the Mekong River Commission in fisheries research, and looking at the impacts of the last few seasons of insufficient water and shifting of the wet-dry cycle. And I see Courtney would also like to comment on that. Jake?
Maybe I'll just answer Richard's question about the fisheries research. So the MRC's got a long and admirable tradition in fisheries research. It is, the go-to place in the region. I think, however, there is almost a sort of an iron curtain between the fisheries data and their impact on decision making, particularly on energy and particularly on hydropower. Fisheries is put into the fisheries box, into the environment box, and over here is the energy. And there's no effective communication. So excellent work has been done. There are gaps, but we know a great deal. I presented some of the facts and figures. Those are all MRC data. I should have mentioned it. But there is no effective use of those data in regional planning.
I like your analogy of boxes. Mekong River Commission is also kind of stuck in a box where the only energy discussion that happens is about hydropower, right?
Yes, energy is synonymous with hydropower.
Right. Yeah, we've been talking about all these opportunities, right? In ways to link energy development to conservation rather than linking energy development to building dams. It's a much bigger discourse that needs to happen. And I've argued for long that the MRC needs to jump into that discourse, needs to have a role in researching and exploring alternatives. The MRC leadership has articulated the idea of alternatives in the past and renewable energy. I think it's time that we see some support given to the MRC to build out an energy research team that can look at some of these alternatives. Okay, another question comes from Dr. Liliana Corridor, asking about some details on Laos, saying that the latest update from Laos says there are several dams on the Sekong River under development, Sekong 4A, 3B, 3A, all north of Attapua in southern Laos. And then there's Sekong A that you're all talking about. What's happening? Well, none of those dams has broken ground except for the Sekong A. And again, what we're saying is that the neighbors need to kind of take a stand here for conservation of the downstream and make a statement on Sekong A, express their concern about Sekong A. You know, I've learned that the Cambodian government, the Ministry of Environment, is putting together an application to UNESCO for a World Natural Heritage Site that goes from the dolphin pool at Kratie, where there are over 90 individual dolphins still alive and thriving, but struggling to survive, all the way north 200 kilometers to the border with Laos. The Sekong River, dams on the Sekong River will impact biodiversity of this potentially very awesome UNESCO World Heritage Site, if I can say that. It is one of the most biodiverse parts of the world. There's something like 90% of the world's ibis birds are in that area. Just to note one of the marvelous things about that part of Cambodia and the Mekong. So if something can be said about the Sekong A, and a commitment can be made, not just from Laos, but from all countries in the Mekong to keep that river free flowing, there are enormous benefits, not just for the Mekong, but for the rest of the world in preserving a critically important part of the river for its biodiversity. Not to mention just the food security that river guarantees. Murray Hebert asks, well, there are 4 to 5 coal-producing state-owned enterprises in Vietnam, and they're all very politically powerful. Is it realistic to seriously slow down their coal power plant building without reining in these companies? Thoughts?
Maybe Mai or Dan should answer that
Not
one.
a softball. Not a
May I give a
softball.
little bit information about those 5 projects? Actually, the 5 projects that I mentioned at the beginning, it's under the BOT form. That means, as the lady just mentioned, that some kind of the political powers was there, but that is the already support for the investor to achieve the right of the investment at the beginning. However, they need to put a lot of efforts, firstly, to make sure the fuel for the power, that mean the coal source. And nowadays, according to the recent citations of the coal supply around the world, I think all the investors, they are facing the challenges to make sure they have the sufficient coal supply for the projects in the long term. That is the first point. And the second one, that is there would be some primary agreements between the investor and the government of Vietnam before they come to the BOT contract. There was an MOU has been signed, and some of the preparations work and the timeline have set, but some of them miss the timeline. Some of them cannot make sure their coal supply, and some of them are changed in the stakeholder. So those things cause the delay of the projects, and that is the execution for the Vietnam's governments to negotiate and request them to withdraw. So among those 5 projects, one project which is only 600 megawatt capacities they request to convert to the LNG projects, and the Vietnam's government would seriously considers and is likely to approve for the change of the fuel type. And for the other, I think the investor, they do not have much conditions to negotiate right now, because they miss a timeline and they face their own issues. So but the Vietnamese government, they cannot just take away that powers from the plants, because that is the already commitment from the governments, and it would have the challenge on the legal issues of financial compensations in this regard. However, the best way that the Vietnamese governments can do is negotiate and convince them to withdraw. And of course, the investors are from Thailand, from Korea, from many other countries. I think we had the friendships between the Vietnam and those countries, of course, like many other countries as well. However, we maintain the relations by facilitate them to still continue other investment in accordance with the Vietnamese law that they are doing in Vietnam. And if they have the idea or the new intentions to work on the renewable projects or other projects that could be allowed in Vietnam, I think they always receive the support from the government. And in the PDP 8 draft, I think the MOIT, they did not calculate the capacity of those 5 projects into the periods, because they would like to implement the commitment of the COP26, I mean, to reduce the coal. And with the support and the encouragement from the international communities, I think the Vietnam side could plans for more renewable source to take place. And in the short term, maybe the LNGs would have the role there, but not the coal. Yeah, I hope
Thank you.
I can answer the questions.
Great. Yes, they're very comprehensive. And with that, we're going to move to concluding our panel. Everyone, I encourage you to download our report, to go on and check out our social media accounts as well to see some kind of quick summaries of what our report says. We've heard a lot today already about this report. It's time for Vietnam to be bold and to make some both bold and smart choices about the future of its own power development, and make good on those COP commitments, but also to influence the future trajectory of Mekong River development. After all, it is a river system that 20 million people in the Mekong Delta rely on. Vietnam is the world's largest exporter of rice, exporting rice to ASEAN and food to ASEAN and the rest of the world. So it's both a huge income generator, the Mekong Delta, for the country of Vietnam, as well as a food security guarantor for the country of Vietnam. And, I often say that Vietnam needs both a smart home game, if we have a sports analogy, and an away game. Now, Vietnam's national soccer team is getting good at both their home games and their away games. Let's do the same with foreign policy. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. Dan and Maya, I've learned a lot. I encourage all of you tuning in to pay close attention to their work. And you all know you're going to be hearing more from the Stimson IUCN team as well on future ideas and solutions for conserving the Mekong River and smart energy planning. I'm Brian Eiler.